Is leasing a car ever a good deal? What critical mistakes do many people make when they do lease a car? And what can Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock teach us about making sound financial decisions? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 53rd episode of the DoughRoller Podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller Podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Hey everybody, whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Welcome to the 53rd episode of the DoughRoller Podcast. I'm Rob Berger, and have a great show for you today. Actually, the main topic, leasing versus buying a car, comes from a reader named John. He and I had an interesting exchange on this topic, and I'm going to share with you the question that he asked me and how I go about thinking through this issue. Hopefully it'll help you if you're considering a lease or if you know someone who is. Before we get to that, and of course we've got a money tool of the day and a money tip of the day. Before we get to all of that, though, I want to mention briefly a giveaway that I'm launching today. And it's designed to help motivate folks to go to iTunes and leave a review of this podcast. So here's how it works. If you go to iTunes and leave a review of the podcast, a rating and a review, shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net, to let me know that you did. And then at the end of the month, this podcast is in April 2014. So if you're listening to this after April 2014, the giveaway is over. I may do this in the future. But at the end of the month, I will simply randomly select from the folks that have emailed me, and the winner will get a $100 Amazon gift card. Now, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because I want to promote folks taking the time, and it does take a few minutes, to leave me an honest rating and review of this podcast. That, in turn, will help me make it better. Now, I want to stress that the rating you leave me has absolutely nothing to do with your chances of winning the $100 Amazon gift card. I'm going to select from everyone that emails me that they've left a review. I'm going to select the winner randomly. So it doesn't matter whether you leave me a good review, a bad review, a mediocre review. My goal is for you to leave me an honest rating and review as a way to promote, as a way to improve the podcast. And again, I'll randomly select from those that email me, and you'll win. If you're selected, you'll win a $100 Amazon gift card. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. It helps me make the show better. The second thing I want to mention before we get to the money tool of the day is that I can officially say that today I started writing the first of what I hope are many books on finance and investing topics that I plan to publish on the Amazon platform. It's something that I've wanted to do for a very long time, and you know how it goes. You just get busy, and other things tend to take priority. And but I finally buckled down, and the topic is on Roth IRAs and to a lesser extent Roth 401ks. I picked that topic because I just made a terrible mistake as it relates to Roth IRAs. I'm not going to go into it today. That's for a future episode. But boy, did I blunder. And the blunder is going to cost my family, probably tens of thousands of dollars in extra tax payments when we come time to retire. And I'm really kicking myself for it. And, it's like I've got no excuse. I write about this stuff every day. I've no excuse whatsoever. But I thought, if it can happen to me, I live and breathe this stuff, it can happen to anybody. And hopefully it's just the first of many books, but it's a topic that I've wanted to tackle because of my own mistakes. And so I'm tackling the Roth IRA. One thing I want to do is enlist your help. If you have any interest in reading advanced copies of this and giving me your input on the book, let me know. I'm going to probably limit it to 5 people just because it will become overwhelming. But if you are interested in that, shoot me an email at dr@DoughRoller.net. I may set up a private Facebook group for this purpose. I haven't decided, but the basic idea will be to give folks an advance copies of the book, probably as I write it, and to seek your input on it. If you see anything I should add, subtract, mistakes I've made, whatever, that would be a big help. And then, of course, there's no cost to that, obviously. And then when I do publish the book, I'll send you a copy for free. So if you're interested in that, you have questions about Roth IRAs, 401ks, it's something that you have spent some time thinking about and have some interest in looking at the manuscript as I work my way through the book, let me know. Shoot me an email at dr@DoughRoller.net. And that actually brings me to the money tool of the day. It's something that I've literally started using for the first time today, and it's called the Storyline Productivity Schedule. It's kind of, think of it as a to-do list on steroids. The great thing about this is it's totally free, and I'll leave in the show notes a link to where you can get this, but it's totally free. You have to give your email address, and then they email it to you. And it was actually pulled together by an author named Donald Miller, who wrote Blue Like Jazz. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. I've read it, enjoyed it a lot. It's kind of a book about faith, I guess, but it's unlike, I think, probably just about any book you've ever read on faith. And but he has a website, and on that website, they have put together a Storyline Productivity Schedule. And the idea behind it, it's really geared towards folks that have large projects that they want to work on, yet there just never seems to be enough time in the day to get it done. All the other emergencies and fire drills and priorities tend to consume your day. And like me, months, years go by, and in my case, I haven't written a book that I've wanted to write for a long time. And so I just kind of got fed up with it, and I was looking for something that might help me be more productive and focus on not only the daily tasks that we all have to do, but also the bigger projects. And so this productivity schedule, it's a combination of things. The first thing is it forces you to write down your projects for the day, your projects 1 through 3, what you want to focus on. You may have 3, you may only have 1, and record how much time you spend on it. So, for example, in my schedule for today, the very first project, as you might guess, the Roth IRA book. And first thing this morning, I spent 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I wrote it down. So there's a section for your projects. There's a section for your basic to-dos, because notwithstanding a focus on projects, we all have daily things that we need to get done, and so there's a place for that. There's a place for appointments. I have an interview that I'm doing for a future podcast at 3 p.m. today. It's in about an hour, so I've got that on my appointment list. And some other interesting things, like it's important to enjoy life, right, of course, and so there's a section for, hey, this is what I have to look forward to today. It's not just about work. It's not just about productivity, efficiency. It's also about enjoyment. And so what are the things that I'm going to enjoy today? And so for me, I had Starbucks. I've already been there. Time with my wife when she gets home from work. And so you can list that. And so I really like it's a very balanced approach to your daily schedule. It's not just a to-do list. And so far it's been helpful for me. I think it may be helpful for you. That's why I call it the tool of the day, the money tool of the day. And you can just search in Google for Storyline Productivity Schedule, but I will have a link to that in the show notes. Okay, so that gets us to our main topic today, leasing versus buying a car. Let me read you an email I received from a reader named John. He writes, I was wondering what your input is in regard to buying vehicles. For example, I am in the process right now of selling a used vehicle for a good buck. Would you suggest reinvesting this money in a used vehicle that is selling for a small price with low mileage? Or would you suggest leasing? Overall, every vehicle depreciates once you make the buy, so what would be the best decision here, leasing or buying used? Well, that's his question, and it's a very interesting question. And I actually want to begin, how do you tackle this? So the question here is, do you lease a car or do you buy used? And I actually want to change the question that John is asking a bit. The questions that we ask are important. We think that the answers are important. The questions that we ask are just as important. And sometimes you can end up at a different result just by how you ask the question. When I was in law school, we studied this. When you appeal a case, whether it's to a court of appeals, even the Supreme Court, one of the things the appellate court wants to know is, hey, what question is it that you want us to address? And as appellate lawyers, we spend a lot of time thinking about the question we want an appellate court to answer. And when, there's always, two sides to a case. And I've never been in a case where both sides had the exact same question. So let's break down John's question. His question is, should I lease or buy used? There are really two questions in his question. You can break it down into two steps. The first question is this: should you finance your purchase or lease, or should you pay cash? You can lease a car and pay cash. You don't have to accept the monthly payments that the dealer proposes, which include built in one form or another interest payments. You could just pay cash up front. I'll pay cash, and you'd end up paying less than the sum total of your monthly payments. So this leasing versus buying used, really the first part of that question is, are you going to finance the acquisition of the car, whether you lease it or buy it, or are you going to pay cash? Only when you decide that do you get to the second question. If you're going to finance it, do you do that via a lease, or do you do that via a more traditional loan? And this, the way I've broken it out, really underscores an important point and where I want to start in my response to John's question, and that is leasing is a form of financing. In the world of corporations, it's not unusual for a company to want to get a large mortgage off their books. Maybe they have a large mortgage on a factory, and they want to get that off their balance sheet. And so at least one possible way to do this, and the accounting rules are immensely complex, I'm not going to go into them, but is to sell the factory to some third party and lease it back. Well, effectively, what they've done is not much different than a traditional loan, particularly where the lease is a long-term lease, and there are certain circumstances where even with a lease, they have to treat it as if it's a purchase and a loan in the rules of corporate finance. But for our purposes today, the thing to understand is that a lease is simply another way of financing the acquisition of a vehicle. Now, of course, there are significant differences between leasing a car and buying a car and paying with it through borrowing, through a loan. But the key point here, and in response to John's question, is should you finance the car at all, again, whether through a lease or borrowing, or should you pay cash? And if you've listened to this podcast, you know that I am a big, big believer in paying cash for a car. And so in most cases, for that reason alone, I don't think leasing is a good option. Now, of course, you may be listening and saying, well, I can't pay cash for a car. Well, that may be, but are you sure? Most people that either lease or borrow to acquire a car end up buying a car that's more expensive than they probably could afford. I know that I've done that in the past, and that certainly, as I look back on the cars I've purchased, when I was borrowing, I've never leased a car, but when I was borrowing to buy a car, I ended up spending more than I probably should have. And in fact, more recently, we pay cash for a car. The last car I bought was a used Toyota Camry. I paid cash for it, and it absolutely affected how much I spent. And as I was looking at cars and thinking about that money coming out of my bank account, and even for a used car, it's still going to be a lot of money. That really put the brakes on, so to speak, to put the brakes on my spending a lot of money on a car. And I looked at cars that were nicer for sure. But then as the money ratcheted up and more was going to come out of my bank account, it hurt. And so I ended up paying cash. And my mom, who just in the last week purchased a used, it was a Ford Escape, which is an SUV. She bought a used Ford Escape, I think paid just under $5,000 for it, and because of that was able to pay cash. She didn't have a lot of money to buy a car, but she could come up with that amount, and she paid cash. Could she have bought a nicer car had she leased or borrowed? Sure. But I think financially she is going to be much better off in the long run by spending less on a car and paying cash. So that was part of my response when I emailed John back. I think leasing is generally not the best way to acquire a car for the same reason that I think borrowing lots of money is not a great way to acquire a car. The best way is to pay cash. And when you think about leasing, just realize it's simply typically another way of financing a car other than paying cash. Now, with that, let's dive into leases just a little bit. How do leases work? Well, there's no one form of a lease, but there is sort of a standard lease that you'll see a lot, and it's typically, again, although not always, a 3-year lease. That's the first. There's going to be a length of a lease. You can get a 1-year lease or a 2-year lease. What I have seen, most of them are 3-year leases. Sometimes you'll actually see odd lengths, like a 39-month lease. So this isn't set in stone, but typically 3-year lease. And in addition to that, there is a a limit, if you will, on the number of miles you can put on the car. A standard limit is 12,000 miles a year. So in a 3-year lease, you would have a total limit of 36,000 miles you could put on the car. Now, you could actually drive it longer than that, further than that, I guess I should say. But once you go over that 12,000 miles a year, or in the case of a 3-year lease, 36,000 miles, you end up paying a fee for each additional mile you go over that limit. And what I've seen is that typically comes in around 20 to 25 cents per extra mile, which, if you end up putting, say, 15,000 miles a year on your car, which is not hard to do, over 3 years, and if you're paying an extra, say, 25 cents a mile, you've just added, if I've got my math right, about $750 to the total cost of that lease. So the mileage limits are important to understand. That's how a typical lease works. And of course, at the end of the lease, you either return the car or you can purchase it. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But let's dive into how lease payments are calculated, because it'll help you understand some of the issues with leases. It'll also help you, give you some ideas if you are going to lease a car, some things to watch out for. So how are payments calculated? Well, at a basic level, it's this. You take the price of the car, and the first thing they'll do is they'll calculate what's called a residual value. That is, what is the value of this car at the end of the lease? Again, we'll assume a 3-year lease. So what will the value of the car be at the end of the lease, in this example, 3 years? And there's usually a formula for that. And it's usually a percentage of the new price of the car. And of course, that varies from car to car. As a rule of thumb, you could assume after 3 years a residual value of about 50%, although this certainly can go up depending on the car. And so if you take the price of the car, you subtract the residual value, you have what they call the depreciation. So for example, if you have a $20,000 car, it's new, at the end of 3 years, it's going to be worth $10,000. It's depreciated or gone down in value $10,000 during that 3-year lease, and that's the portion of this car that you're going to have to pay for, this loss in value over the term of the lease. Now, there are other factors to consider. There are going to be fees associated with this lease. We'll talk about those in a minute. There will be taxes that you have to pay. Even though you're leasing it, you have to pay a portion of the taxes as if you bought it, sales tax. So there are going to be taxes involved. So how do you go about calculating your payment? Well, again, you start with the price of the car, you subtract the residual value, that gets you your depreciation amount. There's going to be interest associated with these payments, and they call that a money factor. That's the term they use in the context of leases. You'll have to add any fees that you have to pay. We'll talk about some common fees in a minute. And when you factor that in, you end up with your monthly payment. And I'll leave a link in the show notes to some calculators that can help you get a rough idea of what a lease will cost you on a particular vehicle. But that's effectively how they do it. They start with the price of the car, they subtract the residual value, that leaves you with the amount of depreciation. You can divide that by the number of months of the lease. In the case of a 3-year lease, that'd be 36 months. That would give you the sort of the principal part of your payment. And then interest gets added in, this money factor, and that can be significant. And you add that to your payment. And that gets you a rough idea of your monthly payments. Again, there are fees and taxes to factor in as well, but that gives you a rough idea of what your lease payment will be. And when we think about that, let's break it down now and talk about I want to talk about the sort of the 4 key elements of a lease. And as part of that, some things to watch out for and mistakes that folks make. So the first one is the price of the car. You know, when you go and you buy a car, it's very common to negotiate the price that you'll pay. You know, there's the sticker price, there's the price that the dealer pays. And, you know, I think most of us, I know myself included, I hate negotiating the purchase of a car. I just don't like it. It's not a fun process. Some people really get into it. I'm not one of them. But when you go to buy a car, you negotiate the price. And oftentimes, again, it varies on the car, but you're oftentimes paying significantly less than the sticker price. Well, when it comes to a lease, a lot of consumers don't negotiate that price, and it's really important that you do it, because remember how we're calculating our lease payment. We're taking the price of the car and subtracting its residual value, at least as a starting point. Well, so obviously the lower you can get that price, the less the depreciation will be that gets spread out over the term of the lease. So as the price of the car goes down, your lease payments go down. What a lot of folks do is simply focus on the payment. Can I afford the payment that the manufacturer, the dealer, is offering? And that will lead you down a path that I think will result in you paying a lot more for this lease than you otherwise would. So the first of 4 mistakes that folks make is not focusing on the price of the car. It's absolutely something that you can and should negotiate. And there's a great article in the New York Times by Mark Franz. I will link to it in the email, but he talks about his experience leasing a car, even includes a link to the actual lease agreement. And he talks about mistakes that he made, and this is a big one he talks about. He did not negotiate the actual price of the car. He was focused on the lease payment. And I think folks do that because they're not technically buying the car. And so I think somehow in their minds, the price of the car seems unimportant if the lease payment that they are going to make is doable. But trust me, the price of the car is a big factor in the ultimate lease payment you'll make. You'll want to negotiate that price. And as a tip, and this is true whether you're leasing or buying a car, whether you're paying cash or not, never negotiate at the dealer. I don't ever do that. I negotiate over email primarily. That's what I've done in the last couple of cars that I've purchased. I don't want to sit in some dealership while the guy, the sales person shuttles back and forth between me and some unknown manager sitting in some office somewhere negotiating a car. I don't want that just gives them an advantage. Negotiate over the phone, negotiate via email. I think that's true whether you're leasing or buying. But that first mistake, ignoring the price of the car, it's really important. Okay, the second one is the residual value. Now, there are formulas based on the car that determine what the residual value is. I don't think there's a whole lot of negotiating on this point. There is an article on Edmunds about this and how important the residual value is. I will link to that article in the show notes. But here's the real key, is that different cars depreciate differently. Some cars depreciate more quickly, other cars more slowly. And the residual value for a car that depreciates quickly, of course, is going to be lower, and that's going to, all other things being equal, increase the cost of your lease. And so if you can find cars that depreciate more slowly, you will end up with smaller lease payments. Now, there is sort of a pro and con here. If you do find a car with a higher residual value, let's say it's 60% of the new price versus 50%, that will decrease your lease payments. What it will also do, however, is increase the cost of the car if you choose to purchase it at the end of the lease. So that's something to consider. And in that regard, it's helpful to know what you're going to do at the end of the lease if this is the direction you choose to go. But again, a higher residual value will result in lower lease payments. The third mistake that folks make, and the third thing to consider, is this money factor that I mentioned, which is how the dealer will calculate in effect, the interest portion of your payment. And this is where, to the surprise of some, your credit score and your credit history will absolutely affect lease payments and absolutely affect this money factor. But when you look at a lot of lease agreements, they show you your monthly payment and they break it out in a fairly easy way to understand. But the money factor can get totally lost in this. And so it's something that you absolutely want to understand and ask the dealer, what is the money factor? And as you're considering different dealerships, understand what the money factor is that they're going to charge you as part of your lease. It can vary from dealer to dealer. And it's also important as you compare leasing versus purchasing. If you are going to borrow to acquire a car, what kind of interest rate can you get on a straight-up loan versus what a dealership will charge you in this money factor as part of a lease? What I see folks do, and I've read about this a lot, is They just don't even ask. They don't even appreciate what the money factor or the interest portion of a lease. So it's absolutely something to ask the dealership about and to understand and consider, not only between deciding whether to lease or not, but also in whether the lease is a good deal for you and whether you should look somewhere else. The fourth and final factor to consider, and a mistake that many folks make, is not understanding and appreciating all of the fees that go into a lease. And I think in many ways, this is a big part of why so many leases are a bad deal. So let me just rattle off here a few. The first is an acquisition fee. Now, that's not entirely surprising, I guess. I mean, there are fees when you buy a car from a dealer, so it's not as if there are no fees there. And an acquisition fee is something that I've seen before. But in one lease I examined recently, it was $700. That's a pretty significant acquisition fee. So that's one. Two, there's actually something called a rent charge. You think, well, wait a minute, I'm already paying a lease. Why do I have to pay a rent charge? But I've seen this before. It's actually common. It's part of the standard form of a lease, and sometimes it's not a lot of money. In the lease that you'll see, if you look at the New York Times article written by Mark Franz, you'll see that his rent charge, I think, was about $205. That was added to the total cost he had to pay up front to lease the car. Then there are early termination fees. If you want to get out of the lease early, you got to pay fees to do that. There will be extra costs for excessive wear and use of the vehicle. And that's a whole nother topic. But if the wear and tear on the car is above, what you might consider as normal, customary, you could end up paying more when you return the car. And of course, that leaves open the possibility of a dispute with the car dealer. So that's something to keep in mind. As I mentioned earlier, there are additional fees if you go over the mile limit. Sometimes in some leases, the mileage limit is only 10,000 miles. I've seen 12 is pretty common. There are some that are 15,000 miles. But if you go over that limit, you'll pay, I'd say typically 20 to 25 cents per mile. That will be laid out in the lease agreement. And here's the other thing. You say, well, okay, but what if I come in under the limit? If I have a 12,000 limit annually, and what if I only drive 10,000 miles? Do I get some sort of rebate or refund? Nope. No refund for unused miles. So it's sort of a heads they win, tails you lose. And that's one factor that I think people neglect to consider and that can make a lease, and just another reason why a lease is often a bad move. You get no benefit if you come in under the miles. You pay if you go over, and what are the odds that after 3 years you're going to roll into the dealership at exactly 36,000 miles? So again, if you go over, you pay. If you come under, then you've effectively paid for miles you've never used. The third one, the next fee is one that surprised me. Let's say at the end of the lease you decide, I like this car. I'm going to buy it. Whatever the residual value is, I'll pay for it. But they're going to charge you a purchase option fee. Isn't that nice of them? They're going to charge you a fee for the privilege of buying the car you've been driving for 3 years, on top of course, paying for the vehicle. In the New York Times article, the purchase option fee, $300. So as you can probably tell, generally I think leasing a car is a bad idea. The primary reason, after all that I've said, the primary reason is because most folks go into a lease because it's the only way they can afford a car that they want. But what it results in is paying more for a car than they should. They should step back and say, you know what? Yeah, I just can't afford the car that I want, and leasing it is just a bad move. So I'm going to buy maybe a high mileage used car. And as I work through all of the other financial issues in my life, if I can save up over time the money for perhaps a nicer car, I'll do it. That's generally the biggest reason why leases are a bad deal. But when you add all of these other issues in, including all of the fees that I've mentioned, I think for most people, you ought to just say no to leasing a car. That's my opinion. That's what I told John. Obviously, if you have a different view, love to hear it. Shoot me an email at dr@DoughRoller.net. But before we move to the money tip of the day, let me just suggest a few questions to ask yourself if you or someone you know is considering a lease. One is, why aren't you paying cash? Yes, it may mean you can't afford the car that you can lease, but probably in the long run, a better move. Consider paying cash. Two, Is this the least expensive car that will meet your needs? We've talked about that, but it's not. Usually people lease because they can get more expensive cars and make that monthly payment, oftentimes barely. And in that regard, ask yourself, do you have other debt? Do you have other credit card debt, school loans? Are you maxing out your retirement accounts? Do you have an emergency fund? If you're answering no to these questions, you have no business leasing a car. None. And for that matter, you have no business borrowing to buy a more expensive car than you need. Will leasing cause you to get more car than you can honestly afford? And that's what I just summarized. I think it's an important question to ask yourself. And then finally, what will you do at the end of the lease? If you do lease a car, what's your plan? What a lot of folks will do, they lease a car, they don't negotiate the price of the car, they don't consider the residual value, they have no idea what the money factor is, and they just pay the fees. And then at the end of the lease, they pay that purchase option fee and they buy that car. But of course, they can't afford to pay cash, so what do? They finance the purchase of the car at the end of the lease, and the result is they're paying a fortune for this car. Understand what you will do at the end of the lease and consider that in making your decision. Okay, on to the money tip of the day, and it relates to that third question I asked about what Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock can teach us about sound financial decisions. And the tip of the day is this: when you're making financial decisions, go beyond the math. So much of finance involves math, and we certainly don't shy away from it here. And I've, in the past talked about, Excel and formulas and calculations, and the numbers matter. But they're not the only thing that matter. And the reason I bring in Star Trek into this is, if you're a fan of the show, you know that Mr. Spock is he's logical, he reasons through everything. Everything's based on the numbers and the probabilities. And Captain Kirk is full of emotion and gut instinct. And, he listens to Mr. Spock, of course, but sometimes he'll make decisions that Spock just doesn't understand, that don't compute, so to speak. And I think in finances, personal finance and investing, that's true as well. So today I want to give you 4 examples of how and why you should go beyond the math. And the first one is with the debt snowball. We've talked about this before. It's debated, on the internet and articles. When you have a lot of debt that you're paying off and you have extra money, which debt should you pay first? Which debt should you pay? Make your extra payments on? And if you're just looking at the math, the answer is easy. You pay any extra payments towards the debt with the highest interest rate. Simple as that. That will get you out of debt the fastest and paying the least amount of interest. The problem is that it's not all about the math. Getting out of debt is as much about psychology and motivation and our own behavior as it is the numbers. And studies have shown that for some folks, paying off the smallest balance first, even if it's a lower rate loan, can be very motivating. You get that first debt paid off, it feels good. It's just a psychological benefit from doing that. And if that helps you get out of debt, if that helps you with that extra bit of motivation, then you may want to start with the smallest balance first, even if it's not the highest interest rate. Now, I got an email from a reader. I think I've mentioned this before, but I think it's to me, it's a great example of how to put all of this into action. What he told me that he and his family did was they did just that. They started with the smallest balance first because they thought they needed that boost, that psychological kick in the butt, if you will. And it had that effect. It worked. They got that first debt paid off. They felt great. And by that time, they said, we've got this thing figured out. We're now motivated. We can now switch. And now we're going to start paying our extra money towards our highest interest rate debt. So they sort of did a combination, and it worked for them. It was a little bit of math and just sort of gut instinct, or what can help motivate us. So that's the first example of where you need to go beyond the math. The second example, 0% balance transfer credit cards. My wife and I used them to climb out of debt. They were very helpful. Obviously, you're paying no interest on whatever debt you transfer while that offer is is still at 0%. Eventually, they expire, and that's something that you need to know. I've actually have podcast 44 covers 0% balance transfer cards. So if you want to know more about them, you can go to podcast 44. That's at DoughRoller.net/podcast 44. But here's where you need to go beyond the math, because at the level of math, zero balance transfer cards seem to make all the sense in the world. Sure, there's a transfer fee typically of about 3%, but I mean, if you've got credit card debt at 15%, it's a no-brainer, right? Except what a lot of people do, they transfer their 15% credit card debt over to a zero balance transfer card, and then what do they do with that old credit card? They charge it right back up. So what made all the sense in the world from a perspective of math resulted in folks doubling their credit card debt. Now, there are ways to avoid that. You could cancel your old card. Yeah, you may take a hit with your credit score. You could cancel it. You could cut it up. Don't cancel it, but just cut it up so you can't use it. And those are fine. If you need to do that to keep from using the card, do it. But if you think you're going to charge that old credit card back up, don't bother with a 0% balance transfer card. Just grin and bear the 15% interest rate and get it paid off. The last thing you want to do is transfer that debt for what's mathematically a good deal, and then end up doubling the debt that you have. The next example may surprise you a bit, but it has to do with Roth IRAs, the subject of the book that I'm working on. There's a lot of literature out there about whether the Roth IRA is the better deal for folks, or should they go with a traditional deductible IRA. And this, you dive right into the math. And the examples will look at contributing. And if you're looking at just the math, the basic rule is this, that if your tax bracket, the amount of taxes that you pay when you make your contributions, is the same tax that you'll pay when you make your withdrawals in retirement, that it's a wash. It doesn't matter whether you go with a deductible IRA or a Roth IRA. The result will be the same. And that's, again, mathematically, that is correct, except that it depends on what you do with your tax savings with a traditional IRA when you make your contributions. What many people do is it just goes into their overall tax return. They get a deduction for their contributions. And what do they do with that money? They spend it. In order for the math to work, you have to take those tax savings and invest them. But a lot of people don't do that. And again, I'm going to be getting into this in much more detail in future podcasts as well as the book that I'm writing. But the key is, this is where you get into the psychology of money. A lot of folks will spend those tax savings rather than investing them. And in those cases, they would probably be better off with a Roth IRA, even if the math and the taxes would suggest that either a traditional IRA is better or that it doesn't matter. All right, the fourth and final example of why you should go beyond the math, paying debt versus saving. This is always a big topic. Do you pay off all your debt or non-mortgage debt, or do you save for retirement? Do you save for an emergency fund? And when you get out the calculator, what folks tend to do is say, well, let's compare, say, what I think I can earn in the stock market versus the interest that I'm paying on my debt. And if what I think I can earn in the stock market is greater than the interest that I'm paying on my debt, I'd be better off putting as much money as I can in the stock market. Again, that's the math. But when you go beyond the math and you get into the reality, a whole bunch of other issues and questions start to come up. For example, yes, that's theoretically true, but if you put all this money in the market, what are you going to do when the market goes down by 30 or 40%? That's a topic we talk a lot about in this podcast, and unfortunately, many folks get nervous and make some big mistakes when the market is on a decline. And so while, yes, we can look back at history and say the market returned on average 10%, the reality is that most investors never saw anything close to that. Now, the point isn't that one should always pay off debt first before investing. In fact, I generally think in many cases that could be a mistake. But the point is, it's important as you think about all of these types of decisions and many, many more I've not mentioned, to not just look at the math behind the question and what's best for you, but go beyond that and look at the psychology, look at issues of motivation and behavior. It really comes down to knowing yourself, knowing your family, and how you interact with money. And again, whether it's a debt snowball, credit cards, retirement, investing, paying down debt versus saving, all of these questions have a component of math, of comparing interest rates, of comparing possible returns on investments versus interest on debt. And those are important. But we have to look at our behavior as well and what we're going to do in certain circumstances and what motivates us and what doesn't motivate us. So that's the tip of the day. As you think about and make personal finance and investing decisions, go beyond the math. Hope you enjoyed today's show. As always, shoot me an email with questions or comments at dr@DoughRoller.net. And please don't forget to leave a review of the show on iTunes. You can go to DoughRoller.net/iTunes. That will redirect you to the iTunes page where this podcast resides. If you do leave a rating and review, and please make it an honest rating and review, shoot me an email, let me know, and you'll be entered to win that $100 Amazon gift card I talked about at the top of the show. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.